Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor here, and this has got to be this is a special day because we have with us literally one of the leaders in the field of fitness and nutrition, an individual who has been just all over the place, myth busting like it was going out of style. The author of many books, the most recent of which is The Great Cholesterol Myth, in fact, which you may have seen him talking about on the Dr. Oz show. He is the proprietor, and I'm going to give away who it is here with the website name of JonnyBowden.com, and he just released a new fat loss program called Unleash Your Thin. Folks, we are joined by none other than the Dr. Jonny Bowden today. Jonny, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm embarrassed with that beautiful introduction, but thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, brother, it's so wonderful to have you, and I just
Thanks, man.
so appreciate what you have been fearless in your crusade to bust up some of the myths out there, and I can imagine
To wipe out the American Dietetic Association? Is that what you were going to say?
well, I mean, certainly there's so much we could cover today, but one thing I wanted to get started with was your story, because I mean, and certainly there had to have been some adversity along the way, because really, like, you don't pull any punches, brother. You're coming out there with the science and telling it like it is. Tell us your story.
Well, you mean in terms of how I got into this field or how I became a disbeliever in the conventional wisdom about fat and cholesterol and that? Which part of it would you like to hear?
Well, let's do both. Let's start about how you got into the field and how that led you to your myth-busting fat and cholesterol model of today.
Well, I started out, health and fitness was a career change for me. I was a professional musician in the 80s and 70s and 80s, and I changed careers around 1990 and became a personal trainer. I had my own health challenges they're pretty well known. I've certainly written about them and pretty open about, fighting addictions and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I grew up in the 60s, and, it was my idea of a healthy breakfast was an aspirin and a cigarette and a couple of cups of coffee. I was touring with a lot of different musical things and Broadway shows, and I began to kind of take my health under my own wings, if you will, somewhere around the late 80s, and started hanging out with the actors I was working with, and started going to the gym, and started actually seeing the improvements in my own life, my energy, all those other things. And I decided that I wanted to do something in this field, and so I became a personal trainer. And I kind of switched careers late 80s, early 90s, and began working at the Equinox Fitness Clubs in New York when they first opened their doors. Of course, now they're one of the most successful clubs in America. And I was pretty much a true believer in the low-fat diet and aerobic exercise and all of the things that we were taught as personal trainers. I was one of those guys who sent the eggs back if it had even a drop of yolk in it, because God, no, we ate any of that cholesterol and fat, we were going to get a heart attack and put on all this weight. And so I was a true believer in all of that. And in the early 90s, I was lucky enough to cross paths with the great Barry Sears, who is the author of the Zone books, very, very famous biochemist from MIT who wrote, Into the Zone and all the subsequent books in that series. And Barry had at the time a rather revolutionary idea, which is that we needed to eat more fat. And it's hard to imagine how revolutionary that was at the time. I mean, we were all on this high-carb, low-fat diet. We all believed it was just a matter of doing more exercise. If you were fat, you just needed to get on the treadmill and eat less calories. That's still the wisdom today, or the conventional wisdom today, which is anything but wise, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, in a moment. And what I noticed, I remember saying to Barry Sears, if you're right about all this and everybody else is wrong, and he said, exactly. So that was kind of the beginning of the myth busting stuff. And I looked at a lot of the clients I was working with. And as you know, when people come to the gym, the number one reason is to lose weight and look better. I mean, sad but true, very few people come in and go, you know what, I got to get my butt in this gym and lower my triglycerides. It just doesn't happen.
That would be a pretty awesome treadmill hookup where it would actually monitor your triglyceride level while you're going.
Exactly. So, truth be told, most people do come to the gym for weight loss and for looking better and things like that. So, I, like many other trainers at the time, had, clients who were very heavy. And they were doing all the right things, Jonathan. They were eating that low-fat diet. They were eating that healthy breakfast of Special K and orange juice and toast and a bagel, or and skim milk and a banana and all that stuff. And they'd be on that treadmill. And we've all seen people like this at the gym. And they're walking and they're running and they look joyless and unhappy, and they're just putting in their time and nothing happens. Mm-hmm. And we had people like that. Mm-hmm. And I had a number of clients at this time in the early 90s who, against all my better advice, decided to go on this cockamamie Atkins diet, which I thought, oh my God, you can't do that. That's all that saturated fat and animal products and pork rinds, and this guy's nuts. You're going to get a heart attack. You're going to die. And they would do this, and they would come back, and they had lost weight. Well, okay, we were reluctantly beginning to accept that, yeah, maybe you could lose weight on that Atkins diet or one of these high-protein, high-fat, low-carb diets, but it couldn't be healthy. You were definitely going to have like all kinds of problems with your cholesterol and your blood pressure and your HDL and just every other measure you could imagine, except they weren't. They were coming back not only losing weight, but with better energy, lower blood pressure, and improved blood. In many of the cases, their doctors would look and go, what are you doing? This is terrific, Mrs. Jones. And they'd say, well, I went on the Atkins diet. They'd say, you can't be on that diet. That'll kill you. So, they just couldn't believe the evidence of their own senses. And look, I'm not a proselytizer for the Atkins diet. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that a lot of the information we had been taught as personal trainers, which came directly from the American Dietetic Association, which I consider to be the most destructive organization in America when it comes to the health of America. But, we learned the same thing everybody else did. And, we just couldn't wrap our minds around how this could be true. How could you be healthier, lose weight, and follow these recommendations that flew in the face of everything we had learned about what was healthy food? So I decided to do a little investigation. I went back to school. Ultimately, getting a PhD in nutrition and becoming board certified by the American College of Nutrition, the certifying board of nutrition specialists. And I kind of devoted myself full time to nutrition and have been doing so ever since. And by the time I was done with, my kind of foray into this material, I was pretty convinced that we had been misled about what a healthy diet looks like, about what we were avoiding in our diet and why, about the consequences of eating, higher fat, higher protein, about the consequences of eating high carb diets. And I was pretty much convinced that we had really been, I don't want to say sold a bill of goods, but certainly misled, and that the conventional wisdom was anything but wise. And, that's kind of where I got the moniker the rogue nutritionist, because I've been speaking truth to power ever since and kind of, busting myths. And believe me, Jonathan, there are a lot of myths out there when it comes to diet, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cholesterol, saturated fat, and all the rest of the stuff that I've been kind of railing about for the last 22 years. So that's pretty much my story and how I came to be doing what I am doing now. And you mentioned earlier my latest book, which is called The Great Cholesterol Myth, Why Lowering Cholesterol Will Not Prevent Heart Disease, and the Statin-Free Plan That Will. And there's really a direct line from my experience back there in the 90s to this book. And
and Jonny, let me just pause for 1 second before we jump into that book, because I really want to focus on that, because I think that can really impact the lives of our listeners just immediately when they get that information. But one question I wanted to ask you about your experience in this field and seeing the difference between what actually works and what we're told works. Jonny, why, and this is going to sound like a funny statement to make,
okay,
why don't results speak for themselves, both in terms of the fact that if a low-fat, basically low everything other than starch diet worked, we wouldn't see skyrocketing rates of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and basically everything else that could go wrong with the human body. And why don't results speak for themselves when individuals take a more actually balanced approach, taking in more fat, taking in more proteins, and taking in a reduced amount of carbohydrate, and they consistently see better results? Why aren't those results enough to convince the powers that be that we need to change?
Well, this is interesting. I think I don't know if you mentioned this in the introduction, but my original career path was to become a psychologist, and I have a master's in psychology, so I do a lot of reading outside my field, outside the field of nutrition and health, read a lot about neuroeconomics, why people make decisions, how ideas get, Malcolm Gladwell, the tipping point, how do ideas get currency, how do we kind of, start to believe certain things. And I think that the answer to your question doesn't really lie in nutrition. It lies in the psychology of belief. We build a paradigm, and that paradigm says, fat is bad, fat causes heart disease, cholesterol is bad, and then what we basically do is we look around us and we fit what we see, we fit the evidence that we see into that paradigm. Mm-hmm. So, for example, people may remember something called the French paradox. And the French paradox, this is what we were all taught in nutrition school in the beginning, was that here's the French, and they're eating all this brie cheese, and they're eating all this, foie gras, and this fatty stuff, and they don't have any heart disease. Of course, this is no longer true because they've now imported McDonald's and all the American foods over there now, so they're now starting to have skyrocketing rates of heart disease. But at the time that, I was in school, we knew this is the French paradox. How can it be that they're eating all this stuff and they're not having heart disease? Well, the reason we saw it as a paradox is because we couldn't adjust our belief system that those things were bad. You see, if saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease, if cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease, there's no paradox to them eating a lot of it and not having heart disease. It's only a paradox if you're stuck in the belief system. So, the answer to your question is, why don't we look around, see the results, and change our beliefs? People just don't do that. Watch politics shows. Watch the U.S. Congress. You get embedded into a belief system, and then that gets supported with an entire economic infrastructure. Look at the amount of money that's made in cholesterol-lowering medications. $31 billion a year for the two top manufacturers of the two top-selling cholesterol-lowering medications, which are Zocor and Lipitor. $31 billion a year. Do you think that you can just change this stuff around overnight? It would be like saying to Exxon, hey, you guys, we just discovered global warming, and you're having a lot to do with it. They're not so fast. They've got their studies. It's just not something that you can just change around that quickly. I was talking on another interview show about how science actually moves, and I was telling the story about back in the 1700s. You probably heard, everybody's heard, who's listening to this has heard the expression limeys about English people, right? Limeys, do you know how that came about?
Oh, go ahead. Explain.
Captain John Smith was one of the explorers in the English Navy back in the 1700s. He would take these ships out to sea, and half the sailors would come back dead. And they didn't know why. They didn't know what scurvy was at the time, but they knew that they were losing an awful lot of sailors. Somehow, coincidentally, they started putting some limes and lemons into the food supply, and all of a sudden the soldiers aren't coming back dead. Well, what happened was that they were now getting vitamin C, and so they weren't dying of scurvy. Well, that was a pretty obvious thing to see. Do you know how long it took England to put vitamin C on the kind of pharmacopoeia where they actually said, yes, we need vitamin C, it prevents scurvy? 50 years.
Oh, wow.
And that seems to be about the length of time it takes for new information to be accepted and to be – so it doesn't really happen very quickly. And I think that that's part of why we haven't seen everybody just say, hey, you know what? This thing didn't work. Let's change direction. It just becomes a lot more complicated than that.
Well, and I love what you said, Dr. Jonny, about this unfortunate but relatively common human behavior, which is we don't see the evidence and then decide. We often decide and then seek the evidence.
It's called, you know what it's called in neuroeconomics, what it's called in psychology? Confirmation bias. It means you already have a bias to what's the truth, and then you look around you and you see a confirmation of that. And that's pretty much what we do here.
Well, and Dr. Jonny, one thing I want to start talking about the new book, and the way I want to kick that off is potentially an example of this, and an example of an individual being confronted with facts and cognitive dissonance that may not correspond with their training. Like, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Oz. I think he has the best intentions in the world. I believe he's trying to make the world a healthier place. And frankly, I believe if the average American did what Dr. Oz said versus what they're currently doing, they probably would be healthier.
Absolutely.
So That said, when
Yeah.
you when you and your co-author went on his show
Mhm.
and you were explaining the very simple science of like it's about inflammation,
Right, right.
like he almost looked like he was a deer in the headlights. There was a specific moment where you were talking about how many of various patients are prescribed statins in your respective practices, and he was just like, it was as if it did not compute.
Well, I respectfully take a 10% deviation from that point of view from
Sure,
what you
sure.
just said. I thought he was remarkably open, given how entrenched we are in this belief system that cholesterol causes heart disease, that everybody should be on statin drugs, that lowering cholesterol is always a good thing. I thought he was remarkably fair-minded about that. He didn't push back as much as we thought he was going to. He told the audience to push back when their doctors want to put them on statins. He told the audience to get the newer particle test, which we've been preaching about ever since we wrote this book. The only test that makes any difference in cholesterol measurement, it's the particle test. It's not what your average doctor gives. And he did tell the audience that's what you need to get. He did tell women to push back if they were being put on statin drugs. So I think by and large, I want to give him some props for like at least being open-minded to that. And yeah, doctors are not taught that inflammation causes heart disease. They're taught that, they're taught something else. They know that inflammation is a factor, but I think they're only now beginning to understand that it's not just a factor. It's probably the central factor.
And Dr. Johnny, that's actually the key. I totally agree with you. Actually, I was very impressed with how receptive he was. The thing that shocked me more was that it seemed like such a shock to him. Not that he was rude or did not
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of
yeah.
wasn't, but rather that like here's the man who you could essentially call America's doctor if
Yeah,
you wanted to.
yeah.
And the fact that this one of the most the one of the largest health issues in our country, the fact that this seemed like news to him,
Hmm.
that's what worried me a little bit. And I'm curious as to how, I mean, certainly you've done so much work to educate yourself on the actual scientific research, but how if the actual physicians out there are not aware of this and are being educated by reps from these drug
Yes,
companies,
that's exactly right.
then what? I mean, so that was the shock to me was like, oh yeah, no wonder Dr. Oz is famous, super nice guy. But the fact that this was such a shock to him, that's what I was like, oh my God, really?
Well, it's neither here nor there. I mean, the thing that we talk about in the Great Cholesterol Myth is that there are really four major promoters of heart disease, and none of them are cholesterol. Cholesterol is pretty much of an innocent bystander, a minor player. One of the things I said on the Dr. Oz show that I think bears repeating is that trying to lower heart disease by lowering cholesterol is like trying to lower the calories on your plate by taking the lettuce off your double French fries and burger. I mean, yeah, the lettuce has a calorie or two, but is that really the target for that kind of when you're really trying to lower your calories and make a dent? You really want to target lettuce, and that's kind of what we're doing with cholesterol. We're taking this incredibly important vital molecule, the molecule from which you make your sex hormones, the molecule from which you make vitamin D, from which you make bile acids, a molecule which is vitally important for the brain, for memory, and for thinking. You're going to take this and just obsessively concentrate on lowering this kind of an innocent bystander molecule while ignoring the real promoters of heart disease that cause the problem in the first place. And those promoters are inflammation, oxidative damage, stress in your life, and sugar in your diet. Those are the four big things we need to be looking at. If you take care of those, you have no problem with cholesterol. It's a minor player in heart disease.
And Dr. Johnny, I want to dig into that. I mean, that I love
Sure.
that. I love the four part breakdown. The one that I wanted to dig into a little bit. This is a question I have personally. Obviously,
Sure.
sugar, a huge component there. What are your thoughts? I mean, from a biologic perspective, whether you eat 2 pieces of whole wheat bread or 6 tablespoons of sugar, when they leave your stomach, it's glucose. So
It's
how?
glucose before it even gets in. By the time it
Oh,
gets down,
sure.
by the time it gets down to the esophagus, the stomach is saying, "Uh-oh, here comes the ding dongs." I mean, it
Absolutely.
turns into sugar faster than you can snap your fingers.
Well,
So
so
yeah.
and so just out of curiosity, why? So is it intentional that starches is off that list, or are you putting that in the same bucket as sugar?
Oh, I'm putting it in the same bucket as sugar. I mean, it's
Oh,
sugar,
okay.
whether you converts to sugar or whether you take it, straight from the Domino's box. I mean, it still converts to sugar and acts like sugar and smells like sugar and behaves like sugar in the body. So, that I'm sad to say goes for a lot of whole grains as well, or products that are marketed as healthy because they're whole grains. They really all raise your blood sugar about the same, very, very small differences. And I'm including all of those under the heading of sugar. That means breakfast cereals and rice and potatoes and pasta and all the rest, and including the stuff that's got a little bit of brown coloring, so we call it whole wheat. It's not much better than the stuff that it replaced.
Absolutely. Yeah, putting a vitamin pill in a cup of
Yeah.
Coke doesn't make it healthy for
No,
you.
it
And
doesn't.
so, Dr. Johnny, can you dig a little bit into? So, right now, I think most listeners are familiar with the outdated theory that when you eat fat, especially saturated fat, because it's solid at room temperature, never mind that vegetables are also solid at room temperature,
Yeah.
that it gets stuck in your arteries and builds up, and then eventually it gets clogged and it's like
God,
a pipe.
I know
So
it's
how does it
so
actually work?
terrible. Oh, it's so not what happens. It's so not what happens. And I've read so much about how we got on this path in the first place. And they used to have television commercials where they'd actually show grease, and they'd say, "You see this grease in the kitchen sink? Well, that's what's going in your arteries." And we all have that visual, but that's just not what happens at all. And in fact, if I can just take a fast tangent, that's how we got on the cholesterol subject, because, if you think about the dietary recommendations that we've all been saddled with for the last 30 or 40 years, the low-fat diet, the high-carb diet, the fat, you think about this, what is the primary reason that everybody has been warned off saturated fat and animal products? There's really only one reason: because we believe it raises cholesterol. Now, if in fact cholesterol is not the risk factor we thought it was, if it is not the appropriate target for lowering heart disease, then what happens to those dietary recommendations? They collapse like a house of cards. And that's exactly how I got from working in the field of weight loss and dietary recommendations to the issue of cholesterol, because I would talk to clients when I was still doing one-on-one personal training and nutrition, and I'd say, "Look, you guys, you got to lower some of these carbohydrates and don't stop with these egg white omelets. What is this cockamamie egg white omelet stuff? Eat the egg. It's got great stuff in it." And they would go, "No, you can't do that. It's got saturated fat. It's got cholesterol." And only when you see how remarkably dumb that whole thing and I'm not calling people who believe that dumb. I'm saying these recommendations were dumb. It's just not based on what really happens. And only when you see that do you see, wait, maybe these dietary recommendations were wrong in the first place. And that's why it's so important to really go to the heart of the matter and say, what does cholesterol do in the body? Why are we so afraid of it? Why are we avoiding saturated fat? One of the more interesting studies that we talk about in the book, it's actually a couple of studies that happened in the last couple of years. When researchers study this stuff, they frequently, it's hard to do a long-term study where you follow people for 20, 30 years and you see how many people have heart disease. You got to follow them for a long time. It's a big, complicated study. So what researchers frequently do is they use cholesterol as a surrogate. Because you can study cholesterol real easily in 6 months. You can see, does it go up? Does it go down? So what wound up happening is we were using cholesterol as a surrogate for heart disease. So if we eat a certain kind of diet, we live a certain kind of way, and our cholesterol goes up, researchers would say the risk for heart disease goes up. Okay. More recently, some researchers said, you know what? Let's not necessarily use this surrogate marker, cholesterol. Let's see if people who eat saturated fat actually die of heart disease at any greater rate. Never mind whether their cholesterol goes up. Let's see what the actual one-to-one correlation between eating saturated fat and having heart disease is. We're not going to use an in-between marker. We're going to actually look at the food we eat and the result we get. So they did, there were two major meta-analyses, and for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what a meta-analysis is, they look at all the studies that have been done. They combine all the data, and they say, okay, what have we learned from these 15 studies? And two big meta-analyses looked at the impact of saturated fat on actual heart disease. Both of them found zero effect. Saturated fat does not cause heart disease. It doesn't clog up your arteries, it doesn't create plaque, and it doesn't kill you. So it really, we have been concentrating fully on this marker, this cholesterol marker, and which we don't even measure properly, and I hope we'll get into that a little bit, and using it as a surrogate for heart disease, when in fact, saturated fat has zero effect on heart disease.
And ironically, the thing we are told to substitute into our diet.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up.
Is for all intents and purposes, the cause.
Yeah. Now let me flesh that out. You're 100% right, Jonathan, and thank you for saying that. And here's how that works. In our obsessive need to eliminate all saturated fat from our diet, what have we been told? To replace it with the healthy vegetable fats. Okay. So this is what you need to know about inflammation and vegetable fats. Inflammation, most people who are listening to this are familiar with inflammation in the sense of, like, if you stub your toe and the area gets red and inflamed, or you get an abscess in your tooth and it gets all swollen, or you get, an outbreak in your skin and there's all kinds of inflamed redness going on, or you wrench your back on the tennis court and you've got, there's inflammation and it's swollen and it's painful. Most people know that kind of inflammation. That's called acute inflammation, and it hurts, but it doesn't kill. The kind of inflammation we're talking about is a second type of inflammation called chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation, as Barry Sears puts it, acute inflammation hurts, but chronic inflammation kills. Chronic inflammation flies beneath the pain radar. It's not something that you see. It's not something that you notice. It happens in the arterial walls. When you do autopsies on Alzheimer's patients, you see inflammation in the brain. Inflammation is part of every major degenerative disease: Alzheimer's, cancer, obesity, diabetes, even the ones that aren't usually life-threatening like asthma. These are all diseases that have an enormous inflammatory component. That's the inflammation we're talking about. Now, your body, follow me here, your body needs to be able to make inflammatory compounds, and it needs to be able to make anti-inflammatory compounds. And a lot of people say, well, what do we need the inflammation for? Because it's part of the healing process. So, like, if you go back to that splinter in your toe, when it gets swollen and red, that's water and blood and white blood cells rushing down to the area. It's like the initial army that goes there to surround the area. They want to keep a microbe from getting in there. They want to keep an infection from taking place. So this is that inflammation is actually just like a temperature when you have a fever, is part of the healing process. We need to have inflammatory compounds in the body. However, they need to be balanced with anti-inflammatory compounds. So our bodies make both of them. They make inflammatory compounds and anti-inflammatory compounds, and they need to be in balance. Now, what do we make those compounds out of? Well, we make anti-inflammatory compounds from omega-3s. We make, which are, the fatty acids found in fish and flaxseed, the omega-3s. We make inflammatory compounds out of omega-6s, which are vegetable oils like corn oil and safflower oil and soybean oil and sunflower oil and canola oil.
And Dr. Jonny, just really quick, I don't mean to break your thought, but it's not, because you said plant fats, like we're not talking about coconut and avocado.
No. We're talking about the standard vegetable oils that we've been sold, as really healthy, corn oil and all of that stuff.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
You're absolutely right. Coconut's a plant, and so is avocado. But we are talking about the ones that are heavy in omega-6s, which are the vast majority of cooking oils. So we've been told to substitute those. Now, here's the problem. The ideal dietary proportions of omega-6s and omega-3s is 1-to-1. That's what our Paleolithic ancestors got. Our diet, and the research is very clear on this, the most conservative research says that we're consuming 16 times more omega-6s than omega-3s. The less conservative, the more alarmist one says it's as high as 25-to-1. So it's like you got these two armies in your body. One's the inflammation army, one's the anti-inflammation army. You need them both. You're the budget director. You're going to assign funds. What we're doing is funding the inflammation army to the tune of 1,600% higher than the money we're giving to the anti-inflammation army. So this substitution of saturated fat, which is a neutral fat, for all of this vegetable oil has done nothing but increased the inflammation in our bodies. So we are consuming massive amounts of inflammatory fats from vegetable oils. You can't swing a rope in a grocery store without seeing 8 million baked goods, all of which use corn oil or safflower oil or sunflower oil or soybean oil. So we consume tons and tons of these omega-6s and virtually no omega-3s. No wonder we are an inflammation mess.
Mm-hmm. And Johnny, a way that at least in my own life, and I think our listeners will know, like if you are just not conscious of what you're eating, you will take in this 16. I mean, like you will never accidentally eat omega-3s, like unless you're going out of your way to eat fish or flax or like algae. Like there's very few sources of concentrated omega-3s, so it's almost by default. And if you avoid animal products, then you're really like that's all you got left, basically.
That's it. And that's here's a little aside, some of these no-fat programs like the Cleveland Clinic that, they do get results in very sick people. We believe that the reason that they get any results at all is not because they're cutting the saturated fat. It's because when you go on a no-fat program, you stop eating all these inflammatory vegetable oils. Now,
you got your 1-to-1 ratio, right?
Yes, you're not consuming either one, but yeah. Now, I think the no-fat programs are ridiculous, but the point is it may be that lower-fat programs work not because they reduce saturated fat, but because they're reducing the contribution to the diet of all of these vegetable oils, which are just boosting and bolstering inflammation.
Mm-hmm. That's such a profound distinction, Johnny, and I think more globally we have to look at, for example, individuals who go on just eat less diets. Well, if you just eat less of a traditional American diet, you're going to eat less of the 40 to 60% of garbage. So that's why it's not working because you're depriving your body of calories. It's working because you're putting less poison in your body overall.
Precisely correct. Gary Taubes has done wonderful work in this, in pointing that out, that, if you're eating 4,000 calories, most Americans eat, 60% or more of carbohydrates. Well, the minute that you cut your diet, if you kept everything the same proportionally and you just cut it from 4,000 calories to 1,500, you've automatically cut your carbs a lot. And that seems to be, the triggering macronutrient that's really at the heart of a lot of metabolic disorders. So, these things may work not for the reasons we think they work, but maybe because we're cutting back on the very foods, the fats like omega-6s, the vegetable oils, and the processed carbohydrates that are pure sugar. We're cutting back on the foods that are actually making us fat, sick, tired, and depressed. We think they are working because we're eating less saturated fat. They're actually working because we're eating less sugar and less vegetable oil.
Absolutely. No, Johnny, I love it. And Johnny, I hope we can have you back on the show because literally, I mean, I've got a page of notes here. I'm about a quarter.
Are we done already? Oh my God, we're just getting started.
Well, that's what I said. But one thing I do want to do to wrap up here is I want to give our listeners a gift. And that gift is, especially for listeners who might be struggling with this, who may have been, like my wife, for example, who is a very young woman who her physician keeps pestering her about her cholesterol and statin medications.
Oh, dear God.
And is telling her to eat more oatmeal. Tell us what these people should do.
Well, if you're a woman and your doctor's pestering you about cholesterol, please get a second opinion. Oh God, this is very hard to sum this up, but the only population that has been shown to have a modest benefit from statin drugs. Statin drugs, by the way, for people who don't know, are the class of medications that are used to lower cholesterol. Lipitor, Zocor, Pravachol, all the OLs, all the statin drugs. The only population in which they have been shown to have a modest, and let me emphasize modest, way more modest than the pharmaceutical companies would have you believe, the only population in which they've had a modest benefit are middle-aged men with existing coronary disease. Women have almost no benefit from statin drugs. Older people, no benefit from statin drugs. And God knows children have never been studied for statin drugs, even though they're trying to put all kids on statin drugs now as a preventive. So if you're a woman in good health with no risk factors and your doctor's hawking you about cholesterol, please push back. You don't need to be on a statin drug.
And Johnny, what should we do in general if we have quote unquote high cholesterol, or really anything above 200? I start to hear people getting pestered about that.
Oh,
What
yeah.
what what do we say to our physicians?
Well, the first thing that you say is, um,
Pick up a
what's
copy of The Great Cholesterol Myth. That's what
well,
I.
I got to tell you how many people have given that to their doctors, and how many doctors have written back to us and said, "Thank you for explaining this. Thank you for saying that." And you were talking earlier about Dr. Oz and some of the others and their reception. We have found we were very much expecting to get a lot of real bad pushback on this, but I can't tell you the number of doctors who've come out of the woodwork and said, "Thank God somebody's telling the truth about this. We've been saying this for years and nobody will listen." So the thing to push back on is this. Here's the take home point. If your doctor wants to put you on a statin because of high cholesterol, ask him to do the particle test. The old-fashioned test that just looks at quote unquote good and bad cholesterol is out of date by a good 10 years. We now know that there are at least 5 different kinds of HDL cholesterol and at least 5 different kinds of LDL cholesterol. The 2 most important parts to pay attention to are LDL-A and LDL-B. LDL-A, which is a type of LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad, LDL-A looks like a cotton ball. It does no damage. It doesn't adhere to anything. It doesn't get stuck in the artery walls. It does about as much damage as if I threw a cotton ball at you, Jonathan. LDL-B is a nasty little bugger. That's a small little, looks like a little BB gun pellet. It's small, it's inflamed, it's oxidated. It does get stuck in inflammatory pockets in the wall. That's something you want to be concerned about. But if you don't know what type of LDL you have, then your doctor is treating a number. He's throwing a dart at a dartboard with a blindfold on. You have to push back and get the particle test. And what's very interesting is that when people with quote unquote high LDL sometimes get the particle test, they find out all their LDL is LDL-A, and there's nothing to worry about. Now, if it's all LDL-B, there's some things you need to do, like eat a much more anti-inflammatory diet and take a lot of anti-inflammatory supplements, because then you've got a lot of inflammation going on. But you've got to know what kind of LDL you have. It is no longer good enough to simply know HDL and LDL. You got to get the modern test. Just Google particle test. There's at least 4 of them out there. Some insurance companies cover it. If they don't cover it, it's worth the $60 or whatever it is to get it done yourself, because that's the only cholesterol test that will give you any valuable information whatsoever.
I love once again, it's about quality, not just quantity.
Exactly.
Oh, well, Johnny, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I suspect that we have, or you have more appropriately, potentially even saved some lives during this show. So I really, really appreciate that. And I really, really hope to have you back, because we really just scratched the surface.
Yes, we did, and I would love to come back. This was so much fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Johnny. And folks, if you have not familiarized yourself with Dr. Jonny Bowden's work, please do. He is the co-author of The Great Cholesterol Myth, as well as a bunch of other books. So just look him up on Amazon and just buy the whole Jonny Bowden collector set.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's very kind of you to say. Thank you.
My pleasure. Check out JohnnyBowden.com. And then, of course, when you're up there, check out his brand new program, Unleash Your Thin. And remember this week, folks, to eat more and exercise less, but do that smarter. Talk to you soon.